Hey everybody, this is Jay Papasan, and I'm here with Ryan Holiday. We're going to be talking today about reading with an ROI. Really excited about this one. It's obviously something near and dear to my heart, books, but it's how to get more out of them. So some quick housekeeping. Um, Obviously, I'm your host. You can see my Twitter handle there, at Jay Papasan, Ryan, our guest, at Ryan Holiday. If you have follow-up questions or just are feeling enthusiastic, you can definitely share that on the Twitter sphere. You also see the handle for our book at the one thing with the number one, at the one thing book is our handle. You can also visit our site. After this, there's lots of cool stuff on there, and that's also where this webinar will be posted next week so that you can stream it or share it with your friends. Throughout this call, we are going to be taking questions using the questions feature. We always do that at the end of our webinars, allow our host or our guest to answer questions. So as it goes, please feel free to post your questions, and at the end of our time, we will be sure to get to as many of them as possible. A little bit about Ryan. Ryan is a media strategist. He's a prominent writer on strategy and business. After dropping out of college at 19 to apprentice under Robert Greene, the author of 48 Laws of Power, he went on to advise many best-selling authors and multiple platinum musicians. He served as a director of marketing at American Apparel for many years, where his work was internationally known. His campaigns have been used as case studies by Twitter, YouTube, Google, and been written about in Ad Age, the New York Times, Gawker, and Fast Company. His first book, Trust Me, I'm Lying, Confessions of a Media Manipulator, which the Financial Times called astonishing, disturbing book, was a debut bestseller and is now taught in colleges around the world. His subsequent books, Growth Hacker Marketing and Obstacle is the Way, were both published by Penguin Portfolio. Those last two books are really why Ryan's here today. I always try to read about 50 books a year and fall a little short. And then I stumbled on two of his books. First, Growth Hacker Marketing, which I highly recommend if you're a business person. It'll make you ask bigger questions about how you're selling your business or your product. And The Obstacle is the Way, which had some of the best business stories I'd read in a very long time and is a great idea about your mindset. So those are highly recommended by me. But since 2009, Ryan's recommended more than 1,000 books on his website, ryanholiday.net. So if you're doing the math, that's about 200 books a year, or for me, where it hits home, it's about 4 books a week. And true to form, when I walked out in the lobby, what did he have? He had a book with him, because he definitely is filling his spare time, and we'll talk about that, making sure he's getting those done, and he's reading with purpose. And that's something that really appealed to me. So we're going to get into that kind of, if you were going to build a reading habit and to do it with purpose, what would that look like? But before we go in that and actually invite Ryan into the dialogue, I want to take a couple of minutes, and for folks who may not be familiar with our book, The One Thing, just give you the big idea, because if I'm chiming in with Ryan, I don't want to be using language or concepts you don't understand. In its most pure sense, The One Thing is about finding the biggest lever in your life. What is the most impactful thing you can do now or at any time to help you reach your agenda or your goals? A lot of people have seen this popularized as the 80-20 principle. Personally, I found this in business to be about as true as the law of gravity. You always can find something that matters more. And a lot of the top, most effective people in the world, if you read through the notes and you read the small print, they're always telling you to identify what matters most and stick to that and do it first. So it's the 80-20, but it's on steroids. If that's the challenge, what do you get for it? And the metaphor we use is we wanted you to create a geometric progression, a domino fall. Hopefully some of you have just spent, as a child, you've lined up dominoes just so you can get them all to fall down. And the idea of the one thing is when you figure out your one thing, one action can create a lot, right? So one domino can knock over a bunch. And in our research, we actually found that the world record, the last time I checked, was 4.9 million dominoes. So one domino has the ability to knock over many. And then we found this kind of obscure article in the American Journal of Physics where a guy named Lorne Whitehead discovered that a 2-inch domino can knock over a 3-inch domino. And a 3-inch domino can knock over a 4.5-inch domino. Basically, that one domino can knock over not just many things, but more. He built them out of wood, and so that 2-inch domino, by the time it got to 8, was almost 9 feet tall. And he described it, what began with a gentle tick ended with a large slam. That's what we mean by a geometric progression. I always have fun on this slide. It's one of my favorite pages in the book. It's my kid's favorite page. We just geeked out and got out the spreadsheet and said, if you started with a 2-inch domino, how big would that get if you could physically build them? And the idea of that progression is by 18 dominoes, it would be taller than the Tower of Pisa. By 23, it would be higher than the Eiffel Tower. Just 31 dominoes at that pace, it would be 3,000 feet above Everest. And by the 57th, it would almost reach to the moon. I think as we've studied business that that's the shape of success. What starts small grows faster than you think. When you look back, it looks like nothing's happening until so much is happening you can barely believe it. And in our experience, that's how habits are formed as well. It's kind of a hard work in the beginning, and then you get a rhythm. And that brings me kind of to the last point to kind of give you the nuts and bolts of the one thing. When you identify your one thing, using the focusing question in the book, we want you ultimately to take that and form a habit. And in our research, contrary to the common belief that it takes 21 days, we found Australian researchers who believe that on average it takes 66 days for a new habit to form. So 66 days, you kind of work through the power curve to where it gets as easy as it's going to get. So our goal is today it might be about a reading habit. You might set a goal for 66 days to do some new activity, and at some point you stop working for the habit and the habit starts working for you. And in my experience in our research, the most powerful people in the world, they're people of powerful habits. And that's what we want for you, and that's what we want for you in this call. So with that very brief kind of overview of the big concepts of our book, I just want to tell you what we found. It was a coincidence that when we were looking at what would the one thing be for someone's personal life, Gary's a reader, I'm a reader, our researchers are readers, we started looking into it. We immediately found 4 benefits that I don't even know that we're going to go into this today, Ryan, but we found research that when people read novels, it literally changes the wiring in their brains. You know, if you're reading about someone running, the parts of your brain that would make you run are activated. So it is more than just an intellectual experience. It's actually kind of transcends that. We know it's amazing for our kids. We tell them to do it, but we don't necessarily do it as adults anymore. It helps you relax, and it keeps your brain working as you age. So beyond the business benefits and ROI, I think that there's a lot of other reasons that we should be looking at reading. But today I want to talk to Ryan about reading with an ROI. So Ryan, thank you for coming on the show.
It's very good to be here.
Super excited to have you here. I was actually as nervous as I've been about interviewing someone because I just read 2 of your books, and that is it's a crazy thing to hear someone else's voice in your head for a while and then actually meet them in real life just a month later.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
One of the things, Ryan and I got a chance to chat, and I just said I wanted to talk about the reading habit. And he articulated that Warren Buffett had said that one of the best investments he ever made was in a book. And I didn't connect the dots, but in our first book with Gary, we wrote a book called The Millionaire Real Estate Agent. And we share the story of how when Warren Buffett was a young investor, he made a mistake. And he resolved to read a certain book, The Intelligent Investor, 12 times before he made another investment. And that's a book. I had to go look up the quote. That's the book he was talking about, right?
Yeah. I mean, look, that book is what he considers it to be sort of the foundation of his business empire, which is worth, what, $50 billion. And so there you have it. You have one book that was he probably paid, what, $2 for it whenever it came out, or 25 cents, who knows. And there the ROI is a $50 billion fortune. Because I think what you get with books is it's not just the ideas in the book, but you take the author's way of thinking, you adapt it into your own mind, and then you take that out and you get to apply it to everything that you do. So he's saying, like, look, you buy a stock, it's going to go up, but it's not going to go up a millionfold, and at some point it's probably going to go out of business or it's going to change. There's limited upside with the stock, but I think with a book, you know, it has the potential to quite literally change your life, and those are the books that I try to focus on, and those are the books that have made the biggest difference for me.
I mean, it's like you got me thinking in economic terms around books. You know, I'm reading a novel. What are the opportunity costs of reading this thriller over reading Plato? You know, am I going to entertain myself and distract myself, which there's research that shows that's beneficial, or am I going to improve myself? But that idea of there's an ROI. I mean, there's a reason Warren Buffett said that.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's not just an ROI and an opportunity cost. I think those are both really important. But it's also, I think, about saying, okay, what am I going to – I have free time, right? I'm sitting on the couch. I'm not ready to go to bed yet, or I'm at the doctor's office. what am I going to do at that time? Am I going to play games on my phone? Am I going to, am I going to go on Twitter? Am I going to text friends? Or am I going to take a minute to step away from what I'm doing and put that energy into something that could pay, as we're saying, this sort of, 100x, 500x ROI? You could sit down and read in that moment something that changes how you see the world, how you find meaning in your life, how you see your relationships, how you see your business. In that $15 that you spent on a book, it has the potential to change, like, quite literally everything you think about the world. It's not always going to happen.
Yeah.
In fact, it's usually not going to happen. Maybe you take one thing away from that book. But it's that sort of lottery ticket thing that I think I chase as a reader.
I love that, and it's one of the things I know a lot of great business people. That's one of the most fortunate, things that's happened from my relationship with Gary and writing these books. We've gotten to interview some really cool people, and a lot of them talk about reading books. I mean, you're looking at, this is just my on deck circle,
right?
Much less the things that I've actually read and kept.
Sure.
And I've got like 4 bookshelves, that are just waiting for my attention. And this idea of, especially in our world, business readers, or a lot of times health readers, they read whole books. If they get one new concept, one new way of looking at things, that was a great investment for them.
Yeah, well, and the weird thing about investing your time in books is that the more you invest, the more effective you get. So we were sort of talking about this, where it's like, look, if you don't read a lot, it's going to be slow going when you start, and you start picking up books. You're going to, oh, that's the first time that I've heard of this study. And then you realize, like, hey, this is a foundational study in psychology, and you're going to read 15 other books that are going to reference that same study, and you can sort of breeze through that. So it's the more you read, the more you invest. Like all things, you start to pick up a mastery of the subject. You start to see what's good and what's bad. You even start to be able to argue with books, and you get faster and more effective as you go. So like when you hear that, like Theodore Roosevelt read like a book a day as a president, and you're like, how did he do that? Well, it's because he read a book a day before he was president, and was able to, he didn't need introductions to every topic each time they got going. And I think that's one of the myths too. Like when people hear that I read a lot, they assume that I'm a speed reader or something, and they go, what is the trick to speed reading? I don't know anyone that I would say is a genuine speed reader. I just know people that are very knowledgeable, and they can sort of chunk and skip things. And then I know everyone that reads a lot spends a lot of time reading.
Yeah. And
there's no shortcut.
It does get faster. You made me think of something I haven't thought about in a long time. When I was in college studying writing, my vocabulary was very poor, and my roommates was very great. And at the time, I was thinking it was one of those things you were predestined to have. Like his parents were very literary. My dad grew up on a farm.
Right.
But he gave me great advice. He said, when you're reading novels, I want you to, in this notebook, write down every word that you don't know the meaning of. And I took him literally. I just he was my, mentor at the time. So every time I found a word, I would write down the word, I would write down the sentence it occurred in, and then I would have to go back and write a sentence using my own voice. And I filled up 2 notebooks in college doing that.
Right.
But it only took me about 2 semesters, because the more I read, the more words I actually had assimilated, and there were fewer things to look up, and I was just getting faster and faster and faster.
Yeah.
And that's where I credit probably 90% of words like ubiquitous. Like I know what that means because I did that back in 1988.
Right. No, it's interesting. That's what I was going to say. I bet you don't do that anymore, not because you're lazy or you've stopped doing the good habit. It's that you rarely run into words that are totally new to you. So I think that's really interesting, and it definitely matches with my experience.
Yeah, and it's how you get fast. And I don't want to steal your thunder. You actually, when we were talking, you get asked this question a lot.
Yes.
So you have kind of like a 3-point, this is how you read for more impact.
Sure. I mean, if I was saying, like, what are the sort of 3 rules that I try to think about in my reading habit, or that undergird my reading philosophy, the number one is actually making an investment and a commitment. Like people go, how do you have time to read so much? And it's like, how do you have time to watch TV or eat dinner, or when something is important to you, you make time for it. So that's number one. And I carry a book around. I tell myself that I'm going to read every day. When I see a book that I like, I don't go, oh, can I afford that? It's like, look, I can afford it because I want it and I need it, and I know there's going to be a return on my investment in general. You don't, when you make this commitment to read, you don't let anything get in your way. So I think that's number one, sort of thinking about this not as this fun activity that you do or this luxury you do when you're not busy, but as a central part of your existence. Like, one interesting thing I realized when I was working at American Apparel is, like, some of the best things that I did for that company came from books that I read, like strategies that I learned from reading. Yet, if I were to kick up my feet and read at my desk, someone would think I was not working, right? Which is this weird thing with companies. Like, we think that reading is not work, even though reading brings ideas that make us better at our job. So I was like, I'm not going to put up with that. I realize I can't read at the office. I'm going to read at home and spend less time in the office. But I'm just going to, for me, it was this decision that reading is part of my job. Even if someone didn't assign it to me, reading is part of my job. And I think if people make that commitment to themselves, they'll no longer wonder why you don't have time to read.
And I think it's about, I've talked to a lot of people about establishing this habit. And in our book, we didn't go that far into it. The time you most control is in the morning, right?
Yeah.
There's less happening.
Mm-hmm.
And when I've interviewed writers, I did 2 anthologies of writers, like, they always found time in the morning.
Yeah.
If you really say, I don't have time to read, just set your alarm an hour earlier. Now you've got a whole hour to read.
Yeah.
And there's nothing going on Facebook. There's nothing going on TV, right? The world is quiet. It's just you and your book, and you can actually read for self-improvement. There's always a way to find time if you make it a priority.
Agreed. So number 2 for me is, I'm not just reading everything that pops into my head.
Hold on. I want to go back to that. I just want, you hit a couple things. Always carry a book. I want to make this practical.
Okay.
So always carry a book.
Yes.
You said it before, because I've read your articles to prepare for this. Get rid of all the games on your phone.
Yes.
There's a lot of ways we fill time waiting in lines.
Right. Fill
it with a good book.
Yes. Waiting rooms. Like, I do most of my, it's like, oh, I just read for 5 minutes while I was waiting for you to come get me. Like, that's how that works. I like to read before bed too. Like, I think a good rule I got from Austin Kleon, who also lives in Austin.
Right. Feel like an artist.
Yeah. He says, like, you should have a period before bed where you don't use your phone. And you can do whatever you want in that period, but you end up reading a lot during that period.
Well, we had Charles Poliquin, who's a famous street coach, in December, and one of the things he said, not only just not use the phone, don't have it within 4 feet of your bed while you sleep.
Sure. Right.
So I remember when I would study for tests, if I studied right before I went to bed, it was like my brain was working at night while I was asleep.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the principle? Like, if you put the phone away, read, that, like, you kind of absorb more if you do it late at night?
I mean, I think so. It's like the morning, where it's like a quiet, undisturbed time, and you can, like, really, there's less noise, there's less going on, there's less pulling you away from the book. You're not going to get a phone call at 10:30 when you're working on your book, unless your life is total chaos, you know?
All right, well, there's equal sides of the equation. I get up early because I've got 2 kids, and for me, reading at night is an exercise in falling asleep with a book in my hands often.
Sure.
And
but
I know some people that are
that
way. And that's often when I read for just pure pleasure in the morning time for me. But I know people who flip that completely, and I think there's great benefit to either one. They're bookend times.
Yeah.
And you tend to own your time.
Yeah, where, like, I don't have a commute, and I don't really like audiobooks, but I know tons of people who do all their reading via audiobooks, either at the gym or on their way to and from work. It's about finding the time, like, idle, wasted time, that you could say, I'm not going to let this be dead, pointless time. I'm gonna take some benefit or advantage out of it.
Well, a lot of the folks on this call are realtors, and we spend a lot of time in our car, by and large, as a profession.
Sure.
So I love the idea. Audiobooks can be effective if we do some of the things that you're going to suggest later about finding ways to interact with it.
Yes.
So you can kind of relive the book later.
Yes, totally.
All right. So now that I've made you get a little bit more practical, I'm sorry to make you go back.
No.
You were going to tell us number 2.
So number 2 for me is, I don't just read sort of wildly about, I mean, there's a certain amount of discovery there, but I, like, when you're talking about the one thing, you know, what do you do? What is your job? What is your sort of focus or passion? And then how are you really deep diving into topics that can benefit you? How can you wake up one day and say, I have no idea how this thing works. I'm going to read everything I can about that topic. Mm-hmm. And so I sort of call it this, like, swarm strategy, where I'll read, let's say, like, a couple years ago, I realized I knew, like, nothing about the Civil War other than I'd learned in school. And so I've now read probably, like, 50 different books specifically about the Civil War, some, like, very granular, some, totally personality driven, totally sort of biography, some just academic, some about, what the ramifications of the Civil War are today. So like the point is, I wanted to understand this thing, and I didn't just read one book and say, I know this thing now because I read some top-level superficial thing. It's about sort of zeroing in and deciding, like, I'm going to get to the bottom of this thing, and I'm going to know everything I can know about this thing, so then I can apply it and use it in it's a little different for me. I can because I write books and some of my books have stories, like I can say, like, it's all going to be material for me in one way or another.
Right.
But when I was at American Apparel, it was like I want to study the history of media that explains how we got to the situation that we're in, and that ended up becoming a book for me. But it was really like I kept running into a problem at work, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it, and that took me, to 24 books that spanned, 150 years of publication. And it made me much better at what I did. Like, if you're a real estate agent and sales and negotiation are a big part of your job, well, let's not pretend that was a modern invention. Like, people have been buying, selling, and trading, specifically real estate, for thousands of years. Like, this is something that you can get to the bottom of. This is something you can deeply understand, and you can understand foundationally the things that other people only understand superficially.
I was reading one of the articles where you were writing about this on your blog on ryanholiday.net, and you mentioned that people have been writing and recording their lives and their experiences for like 5,000 years.
Yeah.
The odds that someone somewhere has written about your problem in some way, and this is the key, that was also smarter than you, it's infinitely possible that it's already been solved. You just have to take the time to go look for it.
Yeah, totally. And the person was motivated to write this book because they felt like they had something to share. Like, anyone who's written a book understands what motivates an author to go through the unpleasant process of writing a book. It's usually because you have something that you feel like needs to be said that if you could have learned earlier, it would have saved you like time, trouble, and heartache. And then people sit around and they're like complaining about the problems they have as if no one has gone through this before and hasn't come up with a solution, a solution that was learned through costly trial and error. Like, why would you not avail yourself to that?
When Gary and I wrote the first book, The Millionaire Real Estate Agent, he shared a story. It was really pivotal. A college professor said, Gary, people have lived before you.
Yes.
You'd be wise to go back and learn from them. Don't reinvent the wheel is the conventional way to say it.
Right.
But it is true. And one of the things when you were saying all of that, and I was reflecting over lunch about I naturally read on the web the way you're describing reading in books, right? I tend to, like, I'm researching a bike. I'll open up 4 windows and compare 4 different reviews of the same bike.
Right.
I'm trying to surround the problem so I can understand it and make a smart, knowing decision.
Yeah.
And then if there's something like a gear I don't understand, I'll look that up so I understand what I need to understand the article. That tends to be kind of shallow on the web. Like, the depth of thinking isn't the same. But it's the same process that, people do on the web. You're just saying, let's do this in books.
Yeah, and there's a couple sort of tricks that I like when I'm doing that. So one, I don't think it's just books. You can read articles. You can read Wikipedia pages. You should understand the topic from a variety of different angles. That's what you're trying to do.
Yes.
But when I'm thinking about books, I try to do a couple things. One, I like to start with like a biography or an introductory text of some kind. So like, a business book is not a primary document most of the time, unless it's like some sort of memoir. This is somewhat like, the one thing is the synthesis of so much research, years
Absolutely.
of research. And so I can read that book, and as I'm going through, I can mark, okay, that's a topic that I've never heard of, or you just mentioned a person that I've never heard of, or an idea or a book that I've never heard of. And then I fold pages and I make notes, and then when I'm finishing the book, I go back through and I try to identify one book or article or concept that I then follow from each book. Like, we forget how interconnected knowledge is, and interconnected these ideas are, and you never know where something is going to lead you. And I think that's really important.
I think a lot of the books that I read, like, I love the ones like yours that have a bibliography. Ours was so long we put it online.
Yeah.
And so we're at least saying, here's our influence. Because I was a musician, it's REM or whatever that is.
Yeah.
It's funny is even the authors that don't choose to do that, I've read enough business books, I can go, oh, okay, they read Good to Great clearly,
Yes.
and you can see the influences show up, and you need to go deep into some of those if you really want to understand the topic.
Yeah, and this sort of ties into the third thing. Part of the reason you want to do that is I think it's important to read critically, to not just take everything that you get. It's got to be this interactive, collaborative process. This is not like the Middle Ages and the words are coming down from us on high and we just have to trust them. Like sometimes you read the original source material and you're like, I totally disagree with I think the author took the wrong take from this.
Mm-hmm.
Or I think it's much more complicated than they let on. And that's when I think that's the next level as a reader. It's not just reading an introductory book or a business text and saying like, oh, Jim Collins says this is how it's supposed to go. Ideally, you want to be able to go, here's everything I learned. Now I have to toss 20% of it away because I have I think I understand this more deeply than the author does, or I understand it better. Or I disagree. It's not just about parroting the things that you hear from other people, but starting to get to a level where these are like your peers and you're discussing these things with them and learning is this sort of interactive process.
I love that. And, Gary, we were at a mastermind with some other business people, and our research process came up, and he said basically the way you should read a book as a person who wants knowledge for doing sake instead of knowing sake.
Yeah.
If you're reading a book about a topic that matters to you, right? I'm a trainer, so I'm reading about muscle building or whatever that might be. Do I have an opinion about this going in?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you hear about those called mental models. Like,
yeah.
what do I actually believe? What is the author trying to articulate? And do I agree?
Yep.
And that's it's not a superficial interaction with the book. You're actually thinking and arguing. And the most recent example, and I'll just throw this out, a famous one is first who, then what, right? And that's a big part of Good to Great. It's, get the right people on the bus. And we kind of always wanted to flip it. It's right, okay, you have to know what you need to have done, then the who, and then they get to decide everything else.
Right.
We just always argued with that section. But
sure.
If you've actually thought about it, you'll find yourself, and it doesn't mean they're not valid. It just means that you actually have your own point of view now.
Yeah, I mean, so I love reading the reviews of books. Usually I'll read the book anyway, and I read the reviews after,
mm-hmm.
and I think, okay, here's what everyone liked about it. I agree. I didn't think about this, or I didn't think about that. And then I like to read the negative reviews, not the ones that are like, oh, I didn't like the cover or the ridiculous superficial thing, but somebody who's also a domain expert about this area, and they're like, look, this author's just flat out wrong here, or I think, what about this, or this? And you wouldn't have known that before, mm-hmm. and now you can have a wider appreciation for the author's book. It's not about tossing it out or something, but it's about sensing understanding the context in which this book exists, which is, nothing is as simple, especially with business books, nothing is as simple, as clean as a business book or a TED Talk would like you to believe, and I think so what I do is I take notes on all the books. I write marginalia in the books, like I write things, and sometimes I'm writing like, what the hell is this guy talking about, or like no, or like I disagree, and it's about making the book and the reading process a sort of conversation, because you're not trying to recreate the school environment when you read a book, which is sitting in a chair and someone's just throwing information at you. You're trying to think, okay, I'm reading this book to help me with what I do. Here's the stuff that helps. Here's the stuff that doesn't help. Here's the stuff that if I were to try it would make me worse. I think that conversation is really important.
I like what you just said. I'm reading this book to help me do what I do.
Yeah.
Right? That's what you're going into it with. It's not esoteric knowledge, though.
Yeah.
As a writer, I fall prey to that sometimes. But
mm-hmm.
if you're reading with a purpose, I think I read somewhere that, like Warren Buffett, to go back to the start of this conversation, he spends like 80% of his time reading.
Sure.
And, he's looking at behavioral economics. He's looking at the things that matter to his world. And he's reading so he can do his job better. And I think that's where it starts.
Yeah, and look, I would imagine, let's say he reads 500 pages a day or 250 pages a day, which is a lot. I'm sure a lot of it goes sort of in his head and right out the other side, mm-hmm. because it doesn't, you're looking for, I think you're looking for actionable, practical things.
Right.
Yes, you're also learning and you're also understanding things and you're also just enjoying the beauty of the written word and all of that. But mostly you're hunting down things that you can use and apply. And the other thing I think that people miss is like, that's the author's job. The author's job is to give you actionable, practical things that you can use. And if they're not doing it, just because you spent money on a book doesn't mean you have to read all the way to the end. I quit lots of books. I throw books in the trash. I give them to Goodwill. If I don't, like as an author, I'm extra hard on authors because I know, like when I feel like they didn't do their job, I don't feel like I'm obligated to continue all the way to the end.
Right, right. And that's totally normal for me. I start a lot of books and decide, you know what, there's nothing new here, or they're not being effective. And I just move to the next one. That is one way to kind of clear the deck.
Yeah, sometimes books are clear that it was an introduction and a conclusion, and then they just smacked a bunch of examples in the middle, but you already get what they're saying. That's
great.
great.
Kind of the beauty of a business book. In the first 50 pages, when I was an editor, I would have 50 manuscripts. You learn to be a quick judge.
Yeah.
And a lot of what the author needs to tell you, it's part of their job to tell you up front. Here's what I'm going to tell you.
Yes, right.
So you can form a lot of your opinions right off the front, right out at the very beginning. Well, before we run out of time, I'll just recap. Invest time and resources, right? Find time to read. Read within topics that matter to you, and then kind of go deep. What's the third point?
Oh, so that's sort of what we're talking about, which is interacting with the content. It's a two-way street, not a one-way street. So that's I read with a pen, and sometimes note cards that I take with me. But so my process for reading a book is I sit down, I read the book, I have a pen, I'm going through and I'm marking things that I like, and I'm folding the bottom corner page of each page that I like. Then I take about a 2-week break between each book. After I finish the book, then I go on to the next book, and I keep reading, keep working. And then when I have free time, usually I'll do it on the weekends or in the morning, I'll sit down and I'll go back through that book. I transfer, I learned this from Robert Greene, I transfer all that information to note cards, whether it's a quote or a story or an example
Physical
or a strategy.
Note cards. So you don't use Evernote or anything digital. You're
physical
writing.
4x6 note cards, and I keep them in boxes in my house. Like each one of my books is probably 3,000 or 4,000 note cards of accumulated pieces of knowledge that I can physically move around. You could do it in a journal like a Moleskine. That would be one way. You could do it. Lots of people do it in Evernote, especially people who read ebooks because it's easier. You can highlight it and export it. I actually like the process of taking the text that's in the book and transferring it by my hands. Like I sort of pretend that the information is like literally flowing through me. Like I'm having to take it from here to there. I feel like I remember the stuff better.
I've had this debate with one of our researchers. When he attends things, he takes notes on a laptop, and I write in my notebook. And there is a fair amount of research now that the kinetic act of physically writing things is much better in terms of how we actually learn them.
I mean, I even like to print out articles and do my notes on the articles and then transfer them to note cards. And then the note cards are organized by theme, and I have a set of themes that are important to me as a writer, as a person, as a marketer. And these are things that when I'm having trouble, if I'm writing a proposal or I'm writing a book or I'm writing a memo, I can pull one of these things. And like, politicians use this same system, writers use this same system. Anyone who has to rely on communicating to other people ideas understand how important it is to have a sort of database that you can draw from.
All right, I want to stop right there because that's actually, I want to even broaden it. I would argue that all success in our age is going to be about your ability to communicate effectively.
Sure.
And the thing that when we mine books for our books, because we want to be teachers, we're looking for facts, we're looking for stories, and we're looking for quotes. And if you think about the most effective communicators, they all, like, go watch a TED Talk. They're going to quote people, they're going to tell great stories, and they're going to present facts.
Sure.
And that's the stuff, the stories especially, that you just can't Google easily.
Correct.
Right? I can Google when, where, how, the facts are usually a Google search away.
Sure.
But the message or the stories are harder to find, and quotes can be a little slippery too.
Yeah, and so like I like to read a lot of philosophy, and I think the best things that I write down when I'm researching philosophy are like exercises or like reminders or ways of thinking about the world that by writing down and storing somewhere, you now have at your disposal the next time you run into trouble or you feel stressed or exhausted or whatever that negative feeling is or adversity that you face. You have resources that you can turn to. You're not just doing this on your own as though you're the first person to ever experience this. And part of reading is preparation for what you're likely to face in the future.
Right. And so a lot of that, by the way, I'm encouraging. Obstacle is the way. felt like a dialogue with yourself about all of the excuses you might not have for not doing things or whatever. I mean, I found it to be factual and inspirational at the same time.
I mean, look, writing the book took 3 months. Researching it took, 7 years of reading books, recording stories, writing stuff down, and then the writing was just collecting them and putting them in order. And I think even if I hadn't written the book, if I just run into some terrible crisis, I would have done the same thing.
All right. Well, one last point, and then I'll let you have a last word, and then we're going to invite Ian in to read some of the questions from our audience. We talked about this before. I got to meet a guy named Britt Harris, who's the chief investment officer for one of the largest pension funds in the world, Texas Teachers Retirement Fund. They make about $5 million an hour. Wow. So his dollars per hour, every time he reads a good business book, he does exactly what you said. He types up his favorite quotes in his notes. And depending on who you are, maybe he has leverage. Maybe he says, here, intern, type this. I don't care. The fundamental thing is he created his own little mental cliff notes so that if he needed ideas from that book later, he could only read 13 pages instead of 240.
Yes.
And I got to spend time with John Maxwell. He has whole filing cabinets.
He uses the note card thing. Yeah.
He uses the note card thing. So there are a lot of people out there that I think, just like pure finance guys, all the way to inspirational leadership guys that are taking what you might be saying, this is two authors talking about reading. I think this is two authors talking about what successful people do to prepare for themselves for the world and to communicate with the people around them. And I think it's significant. That's why I wanted to have, I was reading about how you read.
Sure.
And I was like, all the leaders I know read this way.
Totally. I would say there are very few incredibly successful, smart people that would not point to books as being a significant part of their success. Like one very quick story. So my mentor is Robert Greene, who he taught me how to write and read.
Cool.
And he recently, as they were liquidating Michael Jackson's estate, they found that they were selling a annotated copy of the 48 Laws of Power, which is Robert's book, by Michael Jackson. And he's gone through and written all this marginalia and notes. And so it's like, here you have like the king of pop, who you think is this sort of, weird, maybe crazy figure who's just good at singing. And the reality is he's studying texts on like marketing and power and strategy and taking diligent notes and then putting them to use. And I think that is true for just about anyone that you can think of. They just try to keep it secret for the most part because it's their secret weapon.
Or they don't have a reason to share it.
Right.
I actually find, not to just argue with you, I find that the most successful people will tell you exactly what to go read.
Totally. They just don't broadcast that they love books because it's maybe not their image or they have other more important things to talk about. But the next time you meet a smart person, ask them what book they think you should read, and I'm sure it will improve your life.
That's cool. All right, Ian, we have some questions I see a lot of questions. We had about 500 folks out there. So would you jump in and help us curate some of the best questions?
Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
To that very point that you guys were talking about, right here we have Sebastian asking, what are your top 5 books that everyone should have read in their life? Self-development, social life, health. If you feel comfortable giving 3 or 5, which books would you recommend?
So my favorite book ever is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I'm trying to think what I really like the 48 Laws of Power. I think that's an important one. In terms of fiction, I think The Great Gatsby is like this amazing book that I read all the time. In terms of business, one of my favorite business books of all time is Blue Ocean Strategy. I think the 48 Laws of Power, I think Robert Greene's books are amazing. 48 Laws of Power, 33 Strategies of War. I think Mastery is really, really good.
The George Leonard book?
No, he wrote a book called Mastery.
Okay.
But I heard that book is also very good. So those might be some to start. I have a lit. It's hard for me. I read so many books, and each one is important. I don't really have like a list of top 5 best books. But if you go on my website, I have a list of what I call books to base your life on, which should be a good place to start.
Great. On your website, for everybody listening in, it's on the slide, ryanholiday.net. If you could quickly remind the participants, Brenda asked, what was that book that Warren Buffett read, I think it was 12 times?
The Intelligent Investor.
Intelligent Investor.
Yep, by Benjamin Graham, I believe.
Perfect. So another interesting question right here by Nicole. She asked, is there a special exercise that can help me retain the information without the mental distractions while reading? Something that works for you?
So yeah, that's why I think the third step is important. It's not just reading the book, because if you're reading the book, you have no idea what else your mind is doing. Sometimes you can read stuff and you think you're retaining it, but you don't. I think it's important that you're taking notes, that you're marking things, and then there's some process where you review material over time. Like part of the reason that I write, although it's also my profession, if I was just in marketing, I would probably keep a blog, because taking the knowledge and then being forced to interact with it and reproduce it in a new context, like to communicate it with other people, is really valuable. So like this is something that book clubs do really well, is they force you to have a discussion with other people about the ideas in a book. And you could recreate that if you don't actually have a book club. You could write articles about it, you could write reviews about it, you could take notes, you could do all these things.
So that's a perfect segue. There's a question here by Allison that says, what are your thoughts on book clubs? You had started answering that, and the follow-up is it a good idea to discuss books with peers?
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with discussing a book with other people. I think that's how you challenge the material, you interact with it, you learn things that other people learn from the book. I think that's really important. I'm not really in a book club just because my reading schedules are somewhat unique. I have a newsletter on my site where I recommend books each month, and we sort of have this passive book club. And then I try to follow a lot of really smart other writers, and I like to steal the books that they're reading or talking about. Shane Parrish, who writes a site called Farnham Street, is really good. And then Maria Popova, who does Brain Pickings, is also really good. And every week I get a couple books that I'll add to my Amazon wish list and then get around to reading when I have time.
Ben asks, and we still have some minutes, so if you haven't heard your question answered yet, we're trying to get through all of them. We have several questions here to answer. Ben asked, do you think reading a book is different than listening to a book?
Yes, I personally think reading and sitting down in a sort of quiet period is the best way to interact with text, with the ideas in a book. That's how the author when the author was writing it, they were thinking that you would be reading it, not listening to it, for the most part. So I think it's important, but the most important thing is that you're availing yourself of the knowledge. The medium is less important.
There's a good question here. I mean, all the questions are good, but this one particularly, it says, Pat asks, what do you think of book synopses that are published versus reading the actual book?
I think you're missing the point if you're reading synopses of books. What's
synopsis,
the word? Yeah. I think you read the actual book. If it's not good enough to justify you reading it all the way, don't read it anymore. If you want, I think there is some value reading really in-depth reviews or articles about books, but the value in the book is not in the idea itself, but usually in the explanation and the proving and the analysis of the idea. So it's not just about knowing what a book is about, but knowing what's in a book and what's important in it.
Phaetos, I hope I got that name right. Phaetos asks, do you prefer reading several books at once? I think Jay does this sometimes, but I might be wrong. Do you?
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
Sometimes I have 3 or 4 books going, but I usually only have, for work, I have 1 business book going, and I have I'm reading a book for my dog. Mm-hmm. I'm reading a book we have a new puppy. I've read a lot of books on Brittany.
Taco.
I've got a book on budgeting because that's what I'm writing about, and I've got a novel. So I could have 3 books, but they're kind of occupying different parts of my brain.
I read 1 book at a time, totally engrossed in that book, and I think that motivates me to finish it faster and then move on to the next book. But I think it's interesting when, we were talking about swarming and stuff. You're reading a book about a dog. One of my favorite books of all time is Cesar Millan's books on dogs.
Right.
But it didn't really help me with my dog that much. It just helped me with how I think about problems and life. You never know what you're going to end up finding as you try to learn about things and investigate topics.
I've learned about parenting from raising a dog.
Sure.
And it was so this is just another book about how you make positive reinforcement actually happen.
Right.
And the intellectual ideas of parenting were actually being translated to literal instructions in a dog book, which I found very helpful.
I think sometimes the ideas are clear in a different context, and that can be really good.
But for the record, I would take his advice on reading, not my advice. He reads a lot more than me.
So we have time for a couple more questions,
Okay.
and we have a question here from Clark. It's a long one, but I'll go through it. It says, so I have a question about the personal databases you talked about earlier. What is the best way to organize all the information you're reading and storing via note cards?
Yeah, so I if you just Google the note card system, I think my post is like the first one that comes up, and I walk through totally. But so I write it down on note cards. Each note card gets like a theme at the top right corner, and then I organize it. And if a note card fits in more than one theme, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I write the note card multiple times, and then I organize it physically, and I can move stuff around based on what my needs are.
Let's cover one final question. Kim asks, if you read a book a week, that's quite a lot. So how would we work through implementing the things in the book while keep reading other books?
Look, you're reading the book, and then when I finish the book, then I put it aside, and then I read another book. So like reading is sort of happening over here. This is where I'm consuming knowledge. And then over here is where I'm interacting and recording and organizing that information. And there's sort of two different activities. So you're reading the book, and maybe you won't get around to going back through your notes for 6 months, or you won't even have an opportunity to use what you did in that book for 6 years. And you're like, you run into a problem, and you're like, oh, that totally reminds me of this book that I read 5 years ago. I'm going to pick it back up my shelf, and I'm going to go back through it. And you're preparing yourself and building up a database that you can rely on whenever you happen to use it. And not just the books you read, there's also this idea of the anti-library, where I'm sure you have a ton of books that you've never read, but you know exactly when you would know when you need to finally pick them up. Like you've got a mental note in your head of like, okay, now I'm focused on this thing. I've got to go back and pick up that book that I never got around to reading.
I think you just mentioned Blue Ocean Strategy, and I know it's on the shelf over here, and I'm like, oh gosh,
sure.
I just got promoted.
Yep.
Hey, Ryan, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Jay, do you want to see final words for Ryan?
No, it was great. Obviously, if you couldn't tell from hearing both of us talk, this was a passion topic for everyone. So I'll let you take us to the finish line and thank everybody for being here.
Perfect. Ryan, some final words for our audience. We really have enjoyed having you here. A lot of interesting nuggets and information on reading.
No, thank you. It's really good to be here. I love talking about books. Maybe the best sort of most actionable place to start is, I would say, what's a book that you've always been meaning to read or people have always said you should read? Just go buy it right now and read it as soon as it comes and get started. It doesn't have to be this whole big convoluted thing. Just pick a book and start reading it, and then pick another one afterwards.
It's the first domino.
Yeah, right. No, exactly.
Yep.
Well, there you have it, folks. Just some next steps here. Please take the survey that you'll be getting when you exit the webinar. We really use those to try to improve our webinars. Within 24 hours, look for an email that will contain a link to the recording of this webinar. You can also go and within a couple of days go to that website that I have there on the screen, and that has actually an archive of all our webinars. We're growing on our series, and this one will be the 4th, so you can go and check out the other webinars that we have there, interesting topics about health, business, and your personal life. Our next webinar will be on Tuesday, March 24th. At the same time as this one, 3 p.m. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at The One Thing Book and at Jay Papasan to get all the info about upcoming webinars and events. Please follow up Ryan also. You have here his Twitter handle. I'm sure that on his behalf, I'm going to say that if you probably have a question here that wasn't answered, I'm sure he'll be glad to answer it for you. And continue the conversation using our hashtag, The One Thing. You have both of the websites there, Ryan's website and our website. And again, we really appreciate your participation, and we thank you. And until next time.